Greetings to all of my friends and fellow servants in the Memphis Metro District. This is Eddie Brumley, your supervising elder, and I want to begin this video, which is serving as a newsletter this week, on by talking about Bishop Francis Asbury, 1745 to 1816. If you want to read more about Francis Asbury, I would highly recommend a book by John H. Wigger, Wigger. He wrote a book called American Saint, and it is about Francis Asbury. Absolutely powerful book. One of the most interesting books I think I've read in the last 20 years. Just very, very moving. Francis Asbury was called an apostle to America because he, as much as any individual, maybe outside of Jonathan Edwards, shaped the religious life of North America, and his impact is hard to overstate. He was called an apostle to America, but I think he is able to be called that because he was first and foremost a man of prayer. Now, if you know anything about Francis Asbury, this is probably how you picture Francis Asbury. You picture him out on a horse, riding through rain and snow and wind and heat and cold and all of that so that he can bring the gospel to every corner of the colonies throughout North America. And in fact, he spent a lot of his life on the road. In fact, he was on the road again and again and again. Throughout his life, he traveled more than 130,000 miles, and most of that was on horseback or foot. In his life, he was more widely recognized face to face than either Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. Under his leadership, Methodism in America grew from 600 to over 200,000 people in full connection. He had little formal education, yet he was a man of constant reading. His library was a saddlebag, and his classroom was the open road. He lived a life of simplicity and poverty. He owned very little past a few changes of clothes, a few books, a travel bag, and of course, a horse. And again, the picture to the left is how you probably picture him when you think of Francis Asbury. But I think this picture is a more accurate way of thinking about who Francis Asbury was. Francis Asbury was first and foremost somebody who wanted to be in the presence of God. And that meant that he made serious time for prayer. He says in his personal journal, "My present practice is to set apart about 3 hours out of every 24 for private prayer. But Satan labors much to interrupt me. Nevertheless, my soul enjoys sweet and peaceful nearness to God, for the most part, in these duties." And so Francis Asbury, his life and his preaching and his ministry carried weight because the fragrance of God was all upon uh, Francis Asbury, and his words carried weight because behind his words were a man who spent much time in the presence of God. Charles Spurgeon, another man of prayer, once said that he would rather teach 10 men to pray than to teach one man to preach. Preaching has a place, it's important. Both Francis Asbury and Charles Spurgeon both took preaching very seriously, took catechism seriously, took teaching seriously. But they knew that if anything supernatural was going to happen through their teaching and preaching, it had to begin in the throne room of God. I want to recommend a book that's been recommended to us by the Prathers, and this one is called Lead with Prayer. I just finished Lead with Prayer, and I want to tell you, this book has absolutely just sensitized my soul to the need to be in the presence of God, to feel His love, to express my own love for God, to just be in His presence, and to not want to do anything apart from that presence. That's why I want to really challenge each of your churches and each of you individually to join me for 40 days of prayer and fasting. This will begin September 24th, and I'm going to send you a link. My church is going to have a separate link because I'm encouraging all the people in my church to do the same thing that I'm encouraging leaders in the district to do. So the 40 days of prayer and fasting will start the 24th, and then that will overlap some of General Conference, and it'll take us up to our district rally, which is Sunday, November 10th at 3 p.m. at Senatobia First. I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. Now, we're going to follow the ancient practice of the church. And by that, I mean we're going to do two things. One is Sundays are not going to count towards the 40 days. Sundays for the ancient church were little Easters, and on Easter, fasting is not appropriate. So the thought is on Sunday, you should be in your church, you should be with your people worshiping and praying. There shouldn't be a need for additional concentration on prayer, and it's a day of celebration. So I'll ask you not to use that as a day of fasting. For the days that you do fast, I'm going to ask you to follow the Wesleyan fast. And that means basically you skip breakfast and you skip lunch and you have your first meal in the evening when you sit down with your family or whatever your habit is at night. That said, this is not an attempt to do something heroic for God. If you have medical issues where you can't go absolutely with no food, then I just ask you, in the spirit of fasting, to maybe simplify your meal that day. Maybe give something else up, like social media. The idea of fasting is to set something aside that we desire or even need in order to recognize a deeper hunger and deeper need for God. Now, my hope is with the sign up sheet is that we will have somebody fasting and praying for our district, for our conference, and for our new denomination, as well as for our churches every single day during these 40 days of prayer and fasting. So I hope you'll take advantage of that link. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our district rally. Preaching that day will be Tim Prather, our president pro tem. He will be bringing the message. Our worship will be led by Josh Gross and company. We will have breakout sessions, the first being creating dynamic spiritual communities in your church through band meetings. If you don't know what a band meeting is, you'll find out. The second one is leading through prayer. And then our final breakout session will be creating an online presence for your church. I invite you in preparation not only to be in prayer and fasting, but to join me in reading Lead with Prayer. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you at our first district rally.